Welcome to Bodies, Borders, and Breakthroughs, your podcast for a deep dive into the minds shaping global health professions education. In this episode, we delve into the work of Professor Ahmed Rashid, whose work is at the intersection of medicine, global health, and education policy. Our conversation will focus on the role of power, politics, and inequities in shaping these fields. Together, we'll explore how critical and often uncomfortable conversations can be fostered in ways that are constructive and innovative. Welcome, Ahmed. Will you take some time to tell us about yourself and how you see your work relating to crossing real and imagined borders in medical education and global health?
So firstly, enormous thanks to you, Thirusha, for the invitation. It's always a delight to talk to you. First and foremost, I'm a physician, a medical professional, and have been practicing in the National Health Service here in the UK throughout my career. I guess my career has taken me accidentally into the direction of medical education, and then again accidentally into medical education research. And as with many stories that I'm sure you'll hear, it's kind of often rather kind of a winding path, if you like, as to how I've ended up where I am. So initially, I was really fortunate to be given the opportunity to do an academic fellowship alongside my clinical training at the University of Cambridge at the Institute of Public Health. And I was supposed to be doing cardiovascular epidemiology, and that's where I was kind of started in that role. And over the course of about 4 years that I was doing that fellowship, I spent more and more of my time doing education because I enjoyed it, because I felt it gave me the opportunity to really have a kind of more direct impact. And I guess there were areas of education that I hadn't even realized existed. So thinking about what happens with assessment, things about what happens with kind of student support and things related to regulation, and I guess the kind of back office part of education I found particularly interesting, as well as obviously the kind of direct impact that you can have with the learners. And so at the end of that time, I kind of reflected that actually medical education was something that I'd like to do further, and then decided to do a further degree in education, and then eventually a PhD in education. And I guess that almost happened without me realizing that it was happening, if you see what I mean, because the constant throughout all of that was the clinical work that I was doing, and in a sense, the academic work, whether it was epidemiological research or whether it was education or whether it was education research, really was just so interwoven into what I saw as my identity, if you like, as a physician, that it didn't really feel at the time like it was something different. But of course, it was different, and it's led to a very different career path in which I've been involved in predominantly in education leadership roles. So I've been a professor of medical education, firstly at University College London, and I'm now based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I guess education leadership and administration has been the kind of main part of my day job, if you like, for the last 5 or so years. Although, as I say, in my own mind, I haven't really changed my core identity of actually just being a physician who wants to kind of have a positive impact on the patients that I see, which, as I say, was a really helpful constant throughout that journey.
That is exactly the kind of introduction we needed in terms of the richness and the complexity in how your work brought you to the space that you find yourself in now. And it gives me the sense that this is also a dynamic space. And you spoke about leading or finding yourself almost led through this pathway, through the many interesting and diverse aspects and contexts of medical education as a leader, as a fellow, as a student, as a teacher. But to start off with, and we'll get to the other details of what you spoke about a little further on as we speak. What would you say, and you might or might not have reflected on this before, but what would you say was your personal motivation as a person from your own experiences in other aspects of your life or your interest that motivates you to be interested and to be engaged in these different spaces all at once?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Thirusha, and I guess that you're right. I haven't stopped necessarily to reflect on it, but I guess one of the key motivations I think is really thinking about what unique contribution that you can make, and what insight that you have that perhaps is has been afforded to you by the positions that you've held. And I think maybe if I take myself back to where I started that story in terms of being on a job where I was doing kind of very much a very different type of science, maybe than education science, which was a kind of epidemiology. I felt like there were people who could do that. Whereas the work that I now find myself doing, I find that there are fewer people who have the kind of interest and maybe have the perspectives that would allow them to do that. So I guess that there are, when you see your own position in the world, you have to completely zoom out and see how you fit into this enormous, as you say, very complex world.
Mm,
And what are the things that perhaps you could do that others couldn't do, and where you really feel that you have, as you say, the passion and the enthusiasm that mean that you will really give so much of yourself to your work, which I feel really privileged is the case for me.
mm,
And I wonder whether doing a different type of science where actually, not to say that anyone can do anything, but where you don't feel like you're adding something unique from yourself, I guess is a real difference. And as I say, it's a real privilege. I think that you have a moment where everything clicks together and you realize that actually what you're doing enables you to give yourself to your work, which I think is a really powerful, but also a really fulfilling and satisfying way to kind of develop your own career.
That's an incredibly fine-grained analysis of the question I ask, and it gives me two directions that I can go in. The first is around channeling passion, which is what you spoke about, and the other is how you use the discipline to channel that passion. And I think I want to start with um, where the passion comes from, and I'm curious, and we've talked about this many times before, drawing on your positionality and your ancestral roots and in the world, and what histories you reference in your own narrative. What can you say about identity and physically crossing boundaries in the world of medical education? And because your work does that, you work across borders and talking about identities in medical education, and we'll talk a little bit later about how you do that and the discipline involved in the operationalizing of it. But I want to talk about where the inspiration comes from. Does it, or I'm making the assumption, come from your own histories, and how in your personal identity you're able to transgress different kinds of linguistic environments, cultural environments, learning environments?
Yes, absolutely, it does come from that. It comes from that personal experience, as as you might imagine. So, I mean, I grew up on my grandparents' farm in a kind of extremely remote mountain village where I could see kind of snow-capped mountains from literally from the windows, and it was kind of mountains and valleys for miles and miles that you could see, from where you were stood. And there was no TV, no radio, no, definitely no internet or mobile phones. So to grow up from kind of and spend so much of my childhood in that environment, and now I'm sat talking to you in the very heart of central London, one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities, and regularly interact with people from all over the world. So for me, there's been a really sharp contrast in my own life, and I guess I now feel the weight of the kind of what I see as a kind of expectation I set to myself, that having made that journey myself, now having kind of, I wouldn't say unique, but certainly a different perspective on what does globalization mean? What does it mean to be able to, as you say, work across different cultures, different languages, and to, I guess, to operate within them, and particularly when you overlay it onto that the many other identities, so the professional identities and the other kind of socioeconomic
Mm.
differences that come through that. So I work, for example, in a very deprived area, the clinic that I work in. So to see all of these different layers overlap on one another, it's almost, I would say, impossible for me to ignore those. But actually, what's interesting is early in my career, I did ignore those, and now reflecting back, I guess that was part of my defense mechanism of surviving through medical school, surviving as a junior doctor, by actually
Mm.
ignoring the fact that I'd grown up in a very different context, ignoring the fact that I was making these observations quietly in my own head, but wasn't
Mm.
discussing them with anyone, wasn't
Mm.
actually critically engaging with them. And I guess that's why I felt a real sense of kind of fulfillment from being able to engage in the academic process in the fields of kind of global health and education policies, because actually now those reflections that I was having silently, um, as a kind of observer, as you said, as a student,
Mm.
as a resident, and so on, I'm now able to actually intellectually engage with those, and do so in a way that actually, rather than ignores my own position, actually embraces it.
I was taken from in my head and in my imagination from the snow-capped mountains surrounding your grandparents' farm, like a whirlwind journey through your education in the UK and London, and now the the clinics that you work with. And I've worked in similar kinds of clinics in Africa myself, and and being in those various areas, you find yourself in kind of almost a social liminal space between your past and your future and your present and your loyalties to these different people and these different spaces. This was giving me chills to hear that. And I think it's so important, your reflection coming from where you are and where you find yourself in the world at present. Um, because your reflection on being in medical school and training and having to suppress your history to get through medical school is not an unusual one. I think everyone that comes outside the Western medical education training system has to suppress their identity and have this internal battle, pushing aside their their ancestral voices, their local voices to get through this health professions training. And think about that debate. And people do either one of two things: is keep that side of them suppressed and hidden and silent, or bring it out creatively and meaningfully and in a transgressive and transformational way, the way you have. So I think what you've said just now would be very encouraging for younger health professionals. And you've done something fairly unusual in medical education. I haven't come across many people who've done this, where you've delved into um, philosophy and particularly the work of Edward Said. What made it so important for you to delve so deeply into an area that was so far from not just medicine, but epidemiology, where you started? That's kind of boundary crossing that allowed you to cross across the multiple boundaries of writing, operationalizing, and engaging.
So, I mean, I think that it certainly was a kind of transformational moment for me in my kind of academic work when I guess discovered the work of Edward Said, and I think almost immediately was just completely taken by the ideas, and I guess in a sense I saw myself in the work, if you see what I mean by that,
Mm,
in terms of
yes.
my those ideas, as we said, that I'd been suppressing, and those kind of those different I guess perspectives of having crossed, as you say, cross boundaries, cross continents, and seen very different worlds, and how those worlds are expressed in intellectual circles, in the media, in various other ways. And I guess, I mean, there's so much I could say about Edward Said, but I guess that the to get right to the heart of, I think, why it has been so important to me is, um, in one of his books, which is called Out of Place, he talks about the fact that he was a Palestinian in America, and therefore the Americans rejected him and said, "Well, you're just a Palestinian." And when he went back to Palestine, although he was in exile, so he couldn't go back to Palestine, but the Palestinians kind of said, "Well, he's just an American." And I guess it's a really interesting and I guess insightful view of what it is to be in the diaspora. So you on one hand you have this position where you have insight into two different worlds, but actually in another way you're kind of somebody who's removed from both of those worlds, and therefore you really at your most vulnerable, you lose your identity in each of them. And I think that is something that has really just struck me as being an experience that I've had as a migrant, and as somebody who, I guess, has had a share of my life living in two very, very different contexts. Um, and I guess when you find that alignment between your own beliefs, your own experiences, with somebody who's just written and thought about things so eloquently and clearly, that it just provides you with a prism for how you can analyze all sorts of different problems. Um, and in a sense gives you a way of looking at these various issues in a way that I guess highlights and accentuates some ideas that I guess others you may have sensed and others may have sensed, but it provides you a way of really articulating what the issues are, um, and doing so in a way that kind of removes it just from a descriptive, but rather makes it really analytical and critical.
What about courage? And this is we'll close up with this last question. These crossing boundaries in every way, moving from epidemiology to medical education, from talking and dialoguing and pulling people together, moving into different new spaces requires courage. What would you say to people that have been younger people, newer people coming to medical education? What kind of courage does it require, or what does it require beyond courage?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I guess I don't often um, uh, consider what I do as courageous explicitly. But I think what's important is that you act with integrity at all times, and that I guess that you go to bed at night and feel comfortable with what you've done. And I mean that kind of metaphorically, that you're able to be content that the positions that you've taken, the decisions that you've made, have been ones that you can stand by. Um, and of course, there's one has to navigate all sorts of different power differentials and equations in the different contexts that you work in. And of course, I'm mindful of those, as I'm sure everyone else is. But within that operating framework, you have to stand by the decisions that you take. And I guess one thing that I've had kind of throughout my career are mentors who I really trust, and who I really value in terms of their kind of moral judgments, if you like. And often I would talk to them and say, this is what I'm thinking, and they'll never tell me what to do, but it's
Mm,
almost like I know what they would be, and often I've got to the stage now where sometimes I don't even need to talk to them, but I can just imagine what they would be saying to me.
mm,
Um, and I think that is really important. We don't live in this world in isolation. We live in this world and we have others around us. And those people that, I believe are kind of there to help us. We have, I think, most people I've come across, in fact, everyone I've come across has had people that have helped them to get, to kind of refine their decision making. And I think if you A, choose those people wisely, and then B, allow yourself to be accountable to them in a sense of either actually asking them what they think or imagining or knowing what they would tell you, is a really helpful way to, I guess, um, take those decisions in a way that you can live with.
That's a really good note to end with. And I want to say before I give you the last word that I'm always inspired by your passion in how you do everything that you do in medical education, your eloquence both in how you write and how you engage, and your respect in how you engage with people and how you engage with the work. So I'm very grateful to have someone like you who does all this exploration and border crossing in the way that you do. So thank you for that. And if you have a last word for our audience.
Well, if you'll allow me, you've embarrassed me many times in the last few minutes, Thirusha, by saying kind words about me. So, I mean, I take this opportunity, having the last word, to be able to say to you, you know, how grateful I've been over the last however many years it's been that we've been working together to have benefited enormously from your ideas and from your friendship and support. And I think that it's been a really interesting and kind of informative conversation to be able to explore these ideas with you. And I'm very grateful to have had the invitation to take part.